Today we're going to look at the conversation that George and Lenny have with the boss in chapter 2. Okay, the first thing that's maybe worth looking at is the boss's appearance even before they start speaking. And it's all to do with him demonstrating his status. So if you look at the quote, it says he wore high-heeled boots and spurs to prove he was not a labouring man. It's all about saying, look, I don't work in the fields, so I can wear spurs on my boots because they won't get in the way, because if I do go out in the fields, it's because I'm on my horse. So it's all to do with proving that he is above the other labourers. Everything that he wears is to do with demonstrating that. If he rides a horse, then of course he's also physically higher than the other men. So it maybe sort of ties in with the idea that he just grasps every opportunity to prove that to them. If you look at what he does with his thumbs, it's quite interesting. And of course, hands are really important in the novel. Look at everyone's hands. Look at Lenny's hands are physically huge, like bear's paws, displaying his physical strength, aren't they? One of Curly's hands is always like clenched into a fist, displaying his aggression and his intent to create fear in the other men. Look at Candy, who hasn't got a hand; he's just got this stump, and that displays his powerlessness. Well, look at the boss's hands here. What it mentions is his thumbs. So it says his thumbs were stuck in his belt on each side of a square steel buckle. And I think, have a go at doing that now. Stand up and see what I mean by this. The moment you lift your hands up and put your thumbs into your belt like that, what you're doing is you're jutting your arms out to the side. So what he's doing, I think, is making himself seem more physically intimidating. Perhaps to compensate for his lack of height, because if you look at it, he's demonstrated as a little stocky man. He's described as, isn't he? Twice, the other thing to do with this appearance is that it says that twice he squinted at George and Lenny. And I think maybe what that shows is that he's assessing them, he's evaluating, he's weighing them up. But it also shows, therefore, that he's kind of on his guard, isn't he? He's very suspicious, like as if he's sizing up a potential enemy. And I think that's just a little detail that you could use to write about what Steinbeck is trying to say about 1930s America. Particularly if you're studying for your IGCSE, the Edexcel IGCSE, one of the main things you need to focus on is what is Steinbeck saying about the world that he's describing here? What is he saying about the context? And this is just a little detail that you could pick out. What he's saying is that 1930s America is a place of tension and danger and exploitation. Everyone is constantly on the lookout for someone who might get one up on them. And that's what the boss is doing here when he squints at George and Lenny. Okay, it's worth having a look at the dialogue. So just the way that they speak, the kind of sentences that they use. And one of the first things that strikes me, if you look at these couple of pages where the boss is having this conversation with George and Lenny, is that he repeatedly uses questions. So he says, you got your work slips, what's your name and what's yours, where you boys been working? It's question after question after question. And if you think about it, that's what happens normally in a situation where one person has the power over someone else. So think of like a job interview, for instance. It's the person with the power, the person with the status that will normally be the one asking the questions, steering the conversation, driving it forward, deciding on the agenda. And you can see that that's what's happening here. He's very much the one that dominates the conversation. Initially, at least. George then later on starts to speak more when he starts to say when he starts to defend Lenny. And he says, he can do anything you tell him. He's a good skinner. He can wrestle grain bags. He can drive a cultivator. He can do anything. Just give him a try. And George, at that point, I think it's the desperation that drives George to start to speak more. He realizes that because Lenny has spoken and drawn attention to the fact that he's learning difficulties and maybe made the boss a bit suspicious about, what's going on. Is Lenny going to be a capable worker? What is it with these two? Why are they traveling around together? There are all sorts of thoughts and suspicions that are going through the boss's mind. And the reason why George then starts to speak so much is because he's trying to defend Lenny and justify, that he should be given the job and so on. It's desperation that drives George to start to speak more at that point. It's a tense conversation throughout, though, isn't it, this conversation? And I think the other thing, therefore, that you could say is that George and Lenny's financial security depends on the boss accepting them. This is the only job at the moment that seems to be available to them. They haven't got anywhere else to stay. They need the money. They need a roof over their heads. They need some food. It seems as if they've eaten their last couple of tins of beans without ketchup. They have very, very little to their name, don't they? And so they need the job. And so what's evident here is, I think, the power that the boss has over them leads to fear and submission. That's what creates that tension throughout this episode. Okay, the final thing I think to look at here is George's lie. So when the boss starts to get suspicious, George actually comes up with this excuse as to why they travel around together. The boss says, "What are you doing? You trying to take this guy's pay away from him? Is that what's going on here?" And George has to come up with some excuse as to why he travels around with Lenny. And eventually he says, "He's my cousin. I told this old lady I'd take care of him." Now, why does he say that? And I suppose, the alternative would be he could say, well, I travel around with him because I get lonely. Or he could say, well, I travel around with him because if I didn't, Lenny would get into trouble and wouldn't survive, and I feel sorry for him. But neither of those two things are acceptable, are they? In terms of an acceptable image of masculinity in 1930s America. It's not okay, is it? I think is what's implied here. It's not okay to admit that you are dependent on someone else, that you need companionship, that you are vulnerable, that you are compassionate. It's not okay to admit any of those things, because what's valued is independence and strength and self-centeredness and ruthlessness. And so if George started suggesting that he was a bit soft, he's kind of quite soft-hearted and compassionate and caring and vulnerable himself because he appreciated having someone to travel around with, then, wow, that wouldn't be okay. The boss would kind of think, what kind of guy have I got here? Okay, so I think it's telling us quite a lot about masculinity in 1930s America. It is acceptable, going back to why does he lie then? He says he's my cousin. I told his old lady I'd take care of him. I think it's to do with that image of masculinity again. That's acceptable to say that you're looking after him as your cousin. Okay, because what I think that would be suggesting then is that he's taking on this role as the head of the family. He's fulfilling a duty. He's upholding a promise. Yeah, and then therefore what he's doing is he's taking on this position of masculine responsibility. He's the head of the family, and in addition to that, he's a man of his word and he's honourable. That's the kind of guy you want working for you, isn't it? And that's, I think, what George hopes is going to get him and Lenny the position at the ranch. If you found that useful, then please like it and share it and subscribe to English Gorillas.